Thank you. I'm looking at the effects of digital listening on Canadian music industry policy. I would start to ask why a government would intervene in the music to which its citizens listen. On what terms would it do so? Listening is a crucial part of Canada's music industry policy, not simply as an end in itself. Some components of this body of policy also attempt to translate listening, particularly radio listening, into something else, a domestic record business or a national cultural identity. As more of Canadians' music listening becomes digital, all of these aims become increasingly problematic. Now, by digital listening, I'm referring primarily to use of digital networks for listening to music, a form of downloaded files, or alternatively streaming. And at this juncture, it does appear that whereas downloads are in decline, listening to streams is very much in the ascendant. Government policy generally lags well behind such developments, and this is true in Canada as well. Since the advent of the phonograph in the late 19th century, listening to music has been a thoroughly mediated and industrialized affair, but it was not until at least the 1970s or later that the Canadian government began to consider music in these terms at all. And today, most of its current policies remain rooted in the listening practices of that time, that is around 1970. Canada was amongst the first countries to develop such policies aimed at developing its domestic music industry, beginning with the Canadian content quota of 30% for commercial radio, which was introduced in 1970 by the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or CRTC, which regulates both the broadcasting and telecommunications industries in Canada, albeit under very different legislation for each. For some years prior to this, the CRTC and its predecessor had also encouraged private broadcasters to support and promote Canadian musicians through various off-air activities such as talent competitions, donations to music education programs, or support of local music festivals. These so-called Canadian talent development commitments were gradually incorporated in conditions of license for private broadcasters and over time came to be specified increasingly in monetary terms. In 1982, a number of the larger radio ownership groups, with the encouragement of the CRTC, collaborated with the Canadian Independent Record Production Association and the Canadian Music Publishers Association to create a vehicle for administering all of these funds. Factor, the foundation to assist Canadian talent on record, provided loans and grants to Canadian-owned record companies for the production of recordings of broadcast quality. When the Canadian government, through its Department of Communications, introduced its own sound recording development program in 1986, it agreed to let this private foundation Factor administer most of these funds as well, and hastily set up a Quebec equivalent, musicale, to administer that portion of the program directed to Quebec's largely francophone recording industry. Now, in many respects, Canada's music industry policy is actually broadcasting policy. The configuration of music industries through the post-war period was centered on the exchange embedded in the relationship between radio and sound recording. While record companies supplied abundant, nearly free programming for radio stations, radio was the recording industry's major promotional outlet for marketing to consumers. So radio not only translates listening into sales of recordings, it also translates into considerable advertising revenues for the stations themselves. This state of affairs made radio broadcasting an obvious point of intervention for policymakers wishing to promote domestic recording industry. Government worked to direct the benefits of both kinds of translation towards its own nationals and, by extension, its domestic recording sector, reasoning that Canadian-owned companies would be more likely to produce Canadian music. Additionally, Canadian content quotas attempted a further translation of radio listening into a reinforced Canadian cultural identity on the part of listeners. Canadian content quotas thus built on and even reinforced the relationship between radio broadcasting and sound recording in Canada, and in explicitly nationalist terms. Now, as I said, radio listening was also especially appropriate as a site for intervention because of its public character. First, in terms of its being experienced simultaneously and widely by an unprecedentedly large number of audience members. Just as important, radio frequency spectrum the broadcasters used was also treated as a scarce public resource by the government. And because radio stations making these decisions utilized this resource, government could and did intervene through the content quotas and spending requirements described above. In this regard, Canadian content quotas were consistent with a larger broadcast policy regime, which in Canada, due in large part to its proximity to the United States, has always been concerned, if not downright terrified, about preserving and promoting a Canadian national identity against American media dominance. Now, the centrality of the relationship between the domestic recording sector and its private broadcasters became even stronger with the creation of Factor and Musicale, and their administration of federal programs funded by the government directed toward the creation of recordings intended, at least in theory, as radio programming. Broadcasters continued to contribute to the same pool of funding as the government, and the representatives were closely involved in the governance of both foundations. In the 1990s, two decisions by the CRTC even further enhanced radio's importance to Factor and Musicale. The first, in 1995, ensured a minimum annual contribution of roughly $1 million from broadcasters for these foundations. And in 1998, the CRTC agreed to relax ownership restrictions on radio to allow for greater consolidation in that industry. In exchange, 6% of the value of the sale of radio stations was to be directed toward music industry programs. 3% to a new foundation, Radio Star Maker, or Fonds Radio Star, again overseen by representatives from the music and radio industries. 1% to discretionary initiatives, and 2% to either Factor or Musicale. Combined with relatively flat funding from the government since the mid-2000s, the effect of the latter decision has been to make these programs more reliant than ever on contributions from private radio. So in the mid-1990s, contributions from broadcasters amounted to perhaps less than 25% of Factor's funding. In 2014, they constituted over 58% of the total funding for the recording industry, which is about $20 million. Although an overhaul of the federal government's policies in 2001 resulted in a new program called the Canadian Music Fund, which was supposed to reflect an increased emphasis on new digital markets for music, Factor and Musicale continued to administer the largest of the new program's components, which is named New Musical Works. As a number of the other new components have either been eliminated or substantially scaled back over the past decade, this New Musical Works component now comprises the bulk of the entire program. To review then, the successful use of one industry to transform another, as Will Straw puts it, through Canadian content regulations reinforced a relationship between radio broadcasting and sound recording, forming the basis for further policy that in turn strengthened it yet more. As a result, even in 2015, radio listening remains absolutely central to government policy for the music industry, both as an aim in its own right and as a primary means for funding the government's industry programs. And there's no sign that this will change in the near future. Canadian commercial radio remains a lucrative business, revenues of $1.6 billion in 2014, which is about double what it was 20 years previously. Moreover, commercial radio's share of the advertising market has also been relatively stable at about 15% of the total. So under these conditions, there seems to be little incentive to change the current regime. But when we examine the figures for listening, the future looks much less reassuring. Radio listening in Canada has been on a sustained and steady decline for at least the past 2 decades, and as of 2014, Canadians listen to radio on average 16.5 hours per week, whereas 20 years earlier, it was 21.2 hours, so this is a 22% decline. Radio industry's resilience in face of these declining numbers perhaps is a result of the consolidation of ownership that's taken place since that 1998 policy change. Radio has become more efficient in translating listening into advertising revenue, but eventually the decline in listening will register with advertisers, and the value of radio airtime and of the licenses will also diminish. Also, as the industry is now extremely concentrated, merger activity and takeover activity is also very likely to slow down. And both of these developments will obviously have an impact on the revenues of Factor and Musicale, which without a large increase in government support can expect to see their funding decline over time. Now, perhaps the greater challenge for the programs in the longer term is their relevancy for the current configuration of the music industries. Even as radio listening declines, digital listening in Canada is rapidly increasing, particularly in the use of streaming services. So we only started measuring streaming in Canada in 2014. As of this year, 18% of Canadians used some kind of personalized streaming service. 52% of the population had used YouTube to stream music. What we've seen then is in the last half of 2014, Canadians streamed about 6.3 billion songs, according to Nielsen. In the first half of 2015, this has risen to over 10.5 billion. So in 6 months, growth of 67%. Now, this is still small in comparison to the number of songs people listen to over radio, which would clock in at about 150 billion over the same period of time, if you count individual listening. But even so, the significance of streaming, its rapid growth, means that it will be increasingly a proportion of the way that Canadians listen to music. Its significance, again, is already established, and its growth may not continue at quite that vertiginous rate, but will still be growing rapidly. So this is yet to be reflected in any meaningful way in Canada's policies for the music industry. So in 1999, a further decision by the CRTC, they decided to decline to even attempt to set any content regulations on the internet within Canada. In any case, it's dubious on what legal basis they would have done so, not to mention the considerable technical difficulties of that. So not only do webcasters and streaming services have no content requirements, they have none of the obligations to support domestic production that broadcasters and broadcast distribution undertakings do. So if the CRTC's recent television policy is any indication, it's unlikely that services such as Spotify, Apple Music, or YouTube will be required to contribute to Canadian content development in the way that radio, both broadcast and satellite, still does, which leaves digital listening outside of the scope of much of the policy, whether directed by the regulator or the Department of Canadian Heritage. In regulatory terms, digital listening is private listening. This is not to say it doesn't have social aspects, of course, we've seen through many of the papers it does. However, again, from a regulatory perspective, the terms in which listening takes place is over telecommunications networks, and in contrast to radio, this is worked out in private contractual terms, not only between the individual listener and the streaming service, the internet or the wireless provider, and possibly also the device manufacturer, but also between various parties in this relationship. So although wireless spectrum also begins as a public resource, its use is not simply licensed, as in broadcasting, but actually sold outright to telecommunications companies. And in any case, under Canadian law, content of communication across telecommunications networks has always been deemed private. In terms of policy, this is one of the key differences in how the relationship between media and listeners is governed. The decision about what to listen to and when is much more individualized in streaming than in broadcasting, and governments have never even vaguely considered exercising control over the decisions of individual music consumers about what recordings they will buy, whether as physical copies, as downloadable files, or as streams. There are policies that do constrain and affect these choices over digital media. Discussing music in the cloud, Jeremy Morris points out that multiple contingencies of digital listening in this environment, not only which streaming service one uses, but which internet or wireless provider or device. However, these are the policies of private corporations. They're not public policy. So the relevance of regulatory policy for digital listening is largely restricted to ensuring that the contractual arrangements between internet and wireless providers and their customers, or of those between streaming services and these providers, conform to the principles of fair competition. So for example, recently Rogers Mobile, which is amongst the largest providers of wireless service and internet service in Canada, has an agreement to include the subscription fee for Spotify in its customers' regular service plans. Another company, Videotron, which is the largest internet provider in Quebec, has given a 0 rating to the data used by customers for a number of streaming services. That is, customers' use of these services does not use up their allotment of data streaming in their contracts. There have been complaints from competitors over these arrangements, and it's thought the CRTC will eventually act to restrict these practices, but there is no sense in which the Commission will intervene to determine the type of content that should be supplied by these services. All of which is to say that under digital listing, federal policy is increasingly restricted simply to ensuring the orderly functioning of markets. The notion that telecommunications companies or streaming services should contribute to the production of content is not unthinkable, but it would entail a major revision of the way the Canadian government, and indeed most other governments, have approached communication over the internet. The fact that the content of digital listening is treated as a private affair, a matter of the listener's choice, and that the services they choose to purchase undercuts much of the rationale for government intervention in this respect. And again, it's not necessary to look any further than the CRTC's recently published television regulations, which don't attempt to impose any regulatory burdens on the internet delivery of televisual programming. Digital listening over such services is still translated into revenue through advertising or subscription, much as it is on radio, and it's also a source of revenue for recording and music publishing industries, even if not to the same extent as radio. But it is not a vehicle for any public policy goals. So, the policy is not irrelevant, the focus has changed, and its goals are more circumscribed. Arguably, one of the effects of digital listening on music policy in Canadian context is an increased emphasis on copyright, which actually until the 1980s was not viewed by the Canadian government as cultural policy at all. The only significant changes in the music industry policy in the past decade have been in copyright, affected either by the passage of legislation or decisions of the courts. But copyright entails a different set of aims than the other components of Canada's policy regime. As it currently exists, copyright law is increasingly the creature of international treaties aimed at facilitating global trade in intellectual property. It is not concerned with public matters of nation building in the way that broadcast regulations and subsidy programs have been. The emphasis on markets and trade also, it can be seen in an increased focus on export initiatives, which is the part of Factor, which has actually received increased funding over the last few years. So such efforts may help Canada's balance of trade and cultural goods, but the aims are strictly economic. So where does this leave the rest of the music industry policies? The current programs depend more than ever on contributions from private radio. There's no immediate threat to the funding, but as more and more music listening migrates to digital networks, the long-term future for these programs seems dim at best. As the disparity in policy between broadcast and digital listening becomes greater, it may put pressure on regulators to relax the requirements they make of broadcasters, not only in terms of spending requirements, but ultimately content quotas also. And this was one of the decisions the CRTC made with respect to television regulation just this year. So, television broadcasters, cable services continue to operate under the constraints of Canadian content requirements and mandated contributions to domestic production, but the CRTC extended the exemptions from these commitments that digital media enjoy to video-on-demand services that regular broadcasters run. There's no suggestion that any requirements or restrictions be placed on digital media. And again, it's debatable how long you can maintain these in the face of the competitive pressures from digital media. So you're imposing restrictive policies on a shrinking medium while letting a rapidly growing one get away with very little contribution whatsoever. At the moment, the CRTC appears to be backing away altogether from a quota approach and is instead considering how to incentivize the promotion and, quote, discoverability of Canadian content. Whether through algorithms or search engines or whatever. The chair of the CRTC, Jean-Pierre Blais, describes himself as a promotionist. But promotion is not generally a regulator's role or its primary policy instrument. It's long been a concern that government programs in support of the recording industry, they resulted in the creation of, quote, boxes of records nobody wants to buy, unquote. In an environment where recordings have much less possibility of generating significant revenues, these arguments are likely to redouble. We still listen to recordings, but increasingly in forms that do not involve purchasing them. And clearly, listening via music streaming does not translate into sales of recordings and may, according to some studies, even displace those sales. So again, given the considerable disparity in revenues generated by these different kinds of listening, this has profound implications for the viability of the recording industry and of the programs that support it. So the relevance of the programs that remain primarily targeted at the production of sound recordings becomes an open question. Other music industry sectors, particularly live performance, are now of greater economic significance. However, they don't have the same close relationship to radio broadcasting. They don't produce content for the medium. They're instead imbricated within other networks of other industries such as tourism, breweries, and hospitality. And these relationships are not outside the purview of public policy. Canada's federal government is just much less relevant here than subnational jurisdictions such as provinces or even municipalities. This has been recognized by Music Canada, which is the music industry lobby group which represents the Canadian branches of the major multinationals. They're increasingly using their efforts to target cities to institute policies that emphasize music's potential for generating local economic activity. The whole Music Cities movement is, in Canada, mainly sponsored by this group. Local identity plays some role in these policies, and so in this sense, as a site for geographically defined identity, as it shifts to the local, this leaves the national as a somewhat hollowed out designation, operative mostly in terms of promoting a favorable balance of trade and enforcing international copyright regimes. So in a digital environment, some of listening's public qualities, its simultaneity and shared aspects, are absent or attenuated, but for listening itself, the changing relationship with policy may not mean so much. Digital listening, at least its content, is perhaps less constrained by government policy than radio listening. The effects of Canadian content regulations may in fact linger in Canadians' attitudes as listeners in a digital environment. It's something Scott Henderson has suggested. But one suspects any such effect will diminish over time. In any case, with a host of successful musical acts, including artists such as Drake or Justin Bieber or Carly Rae Jepsen, it's debatable whether Canadians should be even concerned that their music will not be heard. Whether they are concerned, or ever were to any large degree, is, again, highly debatable. And in any case, it looks like likely that their concern, like their listening, will be increasingly beyond the reach of government policy. Thank you.